Okay, thank you very much, Navin. So we've got about 10 minutes now, or about 8 minutes now for questions. There have been some questions in the question box, but I thought I would expand out on a couple of those because I think they were mostly for Caitlin. But I thought I might actually ask a question which picks up on one part of one of the questions that was asked, and perhaps get Navin to reflect on some of the ideas in Caitlin's talk, and Caitlin to reflect on some of the ideas in Navin's talk. So for Navin first, I wondered whether you thought that there was how the kind of approaches that Caitlin's talking about in her presentation about letting go, about practices of managed decline, and the kind of need to engage with the inevitability of processes of change in relation to heritage, how you see those, well, whether you think that they would resonate in a policy context, in the policy context that you're familiar with, at both a sort of international level as well as within a kind of national context within India. And also, I guess, from a kind of social point of view, I mean, how would this be perceived within the national context that you're referring to, for example?
I think what you say is perfectly right, and what Kathleen mentioned is the aspect of inevitability is built into something as larger than life kind of a phenomena. It just happens, and however much you may be prepared for a climate change calamity or impact, there's going to be a certain section in your demography, in physically, etc., that is not going to be able to cope up with the reality that dawns upon it. So I think one has to accept it, that there will be a certain loss. The only thing that we could do is perhaps preempt or prepare ourselves to accept that there's going to be a certain loss, try and save as much as possible without disturbing too much of the nature culture environment balance, because that can also lead to it could further multiply the impacts, and eventually try and using this knowledge or let's say using the idea of acceptance of inevitability, deal with the situation and go into the field and try to reduce this gulf of inequality as possible. It's difficult, it's challenging, but that's the only thing that one can look at.
Okay, thank you very much, Navin. And so, Caitlin, a question for you then, maybe to think about some of the ideas in Navin's paper is mindful of some of these issues of social and economic inequality that he raises, both in relation to the differential impact of climate change on people from different social and economic groups and in different parts of the world, particularly in the global south. But also a kind of broader criticism of a lot of the climate change literature, particularly the academic literature, which has been accused of precisely not engaging with these issues of social and economic inequality, and in particular not engaging with the question of race. How do you see these sort of issues that you're discussing in relation to letting go and managed decline? How can we kind of put them into a broader context in which one is mindful of social and economic inequality and perhaps racial inequality? Are these ideas that only make sense in very specific kinds of contexts, or do you see them as more broadly applicable?
Yeah, thanks, Rodney. I mean, I think as I tried to explain and frame, really, I think the relevance of the ideas around loss and letting go, and they're going to be absolutely culturally and site-specific, and so it may be that actually there are ways of cultivating sort of empathy in relatively well-defended and less affected places like the UK by asking people to relinquish things here, because it may then allow them to, as I said, redirect some resource or emotional energy to places where the stakes are incredibly high. And I think that's why the Troubled Waters Stormy Futures project is so interesting, which I touched on briefly, because they were explicitly working between Kiribati, which is an island nation which is threatened with its existence, a site in Cornwall and a site in Wales, and I think there's something we need to be globally aware as we respond to local risk and put that risk in context, and so I'm just sort of spinning out ideas, but it just feels like there's some kind of, I think Navin's last question about, we need to pay attention to what's going on in these places, and it's very easy to look away. That there may be some mileage in even encouraging heritage research to focus on very comparative projects where you sort of pair different communities in very different parts of the world and encourage, and I could imagine actually a generosity that would emerge for people in the UK if they say, okay, I'm willing to let go of my harbor because the money that would have gone to save that is actually going to go and help this community in India. And we are going to create a link that actually understands our histories as entwined and accepts the fact that the UK actually kicked off the Industrial Revolution. It's led to global warming, and actually does some of that deep thinking around inequality and around colonialism in the context of heritage research. And I don't know what that would look like, but it feels like we have to be doing that now, because it just does not make sense to sit here in the UK and try and defend our patch anymore. And that feels really pressing to me right now. And I think, I just think we have to figure out different ways of telling these stories to ourselves.
That's super. Thanks, Caitlin. So we've used up our time for question and answer now, and we have a scheduled break. But I want to thank people and encourage people to keep putting questions into the Q&A, and thank the speakers for addressing specifically questions that have been addressed to them in the Q&A. And I'm sorry if I didn't get a chance to get to your question, but I hope the Q&A session was of interest to you. I mean, the questions in the Q&A to Caitlin seem to be around kind of language and discourse, which I think are kind of broadly interesting things that Caitlin has kicked off the day getting us to think about, and I'm sure that they're things that we'll come back to. So, what does the language that we use mean? What does it mean to be really precise about what we mean about particular kinds of languages, but also what are the sort of broader discursive resonances of particular kinds of concepts, and how do they help us to view things happening in the world and heritage differently? So I think they're helpful things to consider throughout the day and to stick with.